I remember the exact moment I stopped believing it was an accident. It was not the explosion. Explosions happen on ships. You plan for them. You drill for them. You build redundancy around redundancy specifically because drive systems are violent things contained in thin metal skins. And even the best engineering tolerates failure modes that nobody writes down in the official reports. I had been on 3 deep space missions before the Axiom Reach, and on 2 of them there had been cascade events that shook the hull and woke up the emergency klaxons and turned the crew's faces the particular gray color that only happens when a person understands, in their gut before their brain catches up, that they are very far from home and the situation has changed. Those events resolved. We drilled, we responded, we contained. That is what engineers do. So the explosion itself did not tell me. What told me was the sequencing. I was in the forward mess when the Kepler drive went. I know the timestamp. 14/7 ship time, 3rd month of the outbound leg, 41 light minutes from the nearest telemetry relay. I was eating a ration brick and thinking about the ping I owed my sister, who had been asking me for 2 weeks whether I had remembered to put her name on the mission artifact registry. I had not. I was going to do it after dinner, small things. The kind of small things you think about when the large things are proceeding without incident. The forward mess was quiet at that hour. The Vreth delegation had their own meal rotation and kept to it with the kind of precision that I had come to recognize in everything they did. Not rudeness, not antisocial behavior, just optimization. They ate at the hours that best suited their metabolic schedules, and their metabolic schedules had been calculated to avoid overlap with human mealtimes. And I had spent 3 months not being entirely sure whether this was courtesy or something else. The 2 other human engineers on the shift rotation were aft, running post-maintenance checks on the pressure manifolds. I was alone in the mess which I had not minded. I had always done my better thinking in stillness, and the Axiom Reach, 3 months out, was a quiet ship. The kind of quiet that accumulates. First shockwave moved through the deck, plating the way sound moves through water. Not a bang, but a pressure. A physical fact pushed into the soles of your feet before you consciously register it as sound. Then the red panels lit the mess hall ceiling, and the overhead speakers ran through the emergency cascade in the automated voice that mission planners choose specifically because it has no panic in it. Section isolation. Drive corridor. Report to emergency stations. I had my kid off the wall hook before the second announcement finished. I want to be clear about what I knew at that moment. Nothing. I knew the drive had failed. I knew the scale of the cascade. The shockwave energy told me that before any diagnostic did. I knew I needed to get to my station. I was moving. What I did not know, not yet, was that Shaylin Addo was in the drive corridor. She had told me earlier that afternoon that she would not be at the family dinner. We had a tradition on long-haul missions. Something that started before my time, and had become real enough that crew members treated it as fixed on the schedule. The senior engineers from each species delegation ate together once per 10-day, a meal that was unofficially called family dinner and officially called nothing, because the Vreth, who had joined our mission roster 3 years prior, had no equivalent concept, and the mission coordinators did not want to name anything that might create friction. Shaylin always came. She had been on more joint missions than I had. Her Vreth language was better than mine. She had a particular talent for sitting in rooms full of beings who regarded her with mild species-level contempt and somehow making the atmosphere lighter, not by trying, just by being steady. We had worked together for 6 years. I knew her the way you know someone you have spent 6 years solving problems, next to under varying degrees of pressure. Which is to say, I knew her thinking before she voiced it. Knew which silences meant she was working through something, and which meant she had already finished working through it, and was waiting for me to catch up. I knew that she ate the same breakfast every morning, not because she was a creature of routine in the anxious sense, but because she had decided, years ago, that breakfast did not need her full attention, and she wanted that attention free for other things. I knew that she had a sister in the Outer Belt stations, and that the sister had 2 children, and that Shaylin talked about those children. With a softness she showed in very few other contexts, I knew also that she was the better engineer. I say this without false modesty. I am very good. Shaylin is better. She has a quality of attention that is difficult to describe if you have not seen it in operation, a kind of lateral perception that catches the thing that is slightly out of place, while the front of her mind is doing something else entirely. She had caught failure modes in systems I had designed that I had missed. She had caught anomalies in the Axiom Reach's performance data 3 weeks before the mission that had turned out, on investigation, to be the early signature of a minor fuel system misalignment that the standard monitoring had not flagged. She had an instinct for things being wrong. That was not instinct in the mystical sense, but instinct in the trained sense. 10,000 hours of watching systems until the pattern is so deeply known that a deviation registers before you have consciously processed it. She had gone to Section 7 because the anomaly in the coupling report had looked slightly wrong to her. Not wrong in the sense that the diagnostic was obviously false. Wrong in the specific way that an anomaly looks when it has appeared in the data, but not yet in the operational signature, a shape of wrongness she had seen before, in real anomalies, that she wanted to check. Vreth had built their trap correctly. They had modeled the kind of diagnostic irregularity that an engineer with Shaylin's skill level would want to verify in person. They had been right that she would go. They had been wrong about everything else. That afternoon, she had come to find me at my workstation and said she needed to run diagnostics on the auxiliary coupling in Section 7, the drive corridor section. She said she would catch the next one. At the time, I said fine. I said, bring an extra ration bar, it's a long walk back. She laughed. That was the last thing I heard her say before the drive went. I was in the middle of the forward corridor when the second cascade hit, harder than the first, and the bulkhead seals behind me dropped. Emergency protocol, automated. The ship was trying to contain itself. Checked my wrist unit and pulled up the crew manifest, and I found her signal, Shaylin's, and it was in Section 7, drive corridor. The wrong side of 3 sealed bulkheads and a radiation bloom that the ship was already reading as a Class 4 event. I stood in the red-lit corridor with my kit bag in my hand, and the crew manifest on my wrist, and I looked at the bulkheads behind me, and I understood something that I did not have full language for yet. What I understood was this: the shape of this disaster was precise. The cascade had started in a location that would strand the people who knew this ship best. The bulkhead seals had dropped in an order that isolated the drive section. The radiation bloom was exactly where it needed to be to make the rescue math look impossible. I thought about the last 3 months. I thought about the Vreth team's communications traffic patterns, which I had been logging out of professional habit. I thought about the way the senior Vreth engineer, a being named Voss, had asked me twice in the past month about the drive's manual override procedures, framing the questions as cross-species technical curiosity, the kind of thing that happened on joint missions and was supposed to happen on joint missions. I thought about the diagnostic report that had flagged Section 7's auxiliary coupling, which I had seen in the morning briefing, and had noted and had not gone to check myself, because Shaylin had offered to handle it. Thought about who had flagged that report. Vreth mathematics. That is what I was looking at. Not explosion architecture. I turned around and went back. Let me tell you about the Vreth. Because if you were not on that mission, you may not understand what they are. They are consortium beings. That is their preferred self-description, consortium rather than species. Because they function as a biological network in ways that human neuroscience still cannot fully model. Each individual Vreth is intelligent. Connected to others, they are something else. A distributed problem-solving system that has been running on continuous resource optimization models for longer than humanity has had agriculture. They are not what you would call hostile. Hostility implies emotion. They are analytical. They assess, they calculate. In person, they are tall and bilaterally symmetrical in the broad sense, though the bilateral symmetry is approximate. The Vreth body plan is slightly asymmetric in ways that seem to have functional rather than aesthetic origins. One arm slightly longer than the other, the sensory clusters on the head offset rather than mirrored. Their skin has a matte gray-blue quality in standard shipboard lighting, with a subtle texture that I eventually recognized as similar to the granular texture of certain volcanic stone. They communicate in a combination of vocalized sounds and low-frequency vibrations that the translation systems handle adequately but imperfectly. The imperfect handling of nuance in translation is, I came to believe, something the Vreth were aware of and occasionally used deliberately. In the first month of the mission, I had found them difficult to read. In the second month, I had begun to find them familiar in the way that any colleague becomes familiar over time. Not warm, but known. I had understood their professional rhythms, their preferences in technical discussion, the particular quality of attention they gave to a new engineering problem. Cahetal Voss had what I would describe as genuine intellectual curiosity about propulsion engineering. The questions had felt real. The interest had felt real. I do not know how to reconcile that with what they did. I have spent time trying. I have come to the conclusion that the reconciliation is not available to me, and that this is perhaps a limitation of the human approach to understanding. We tend to assume that genuine interest and harmful intent cannot coexist in the same mind. The Vreth had not been pretending to be curious. They had been curious. They had also been doing something else simultaneously, and they had not experienced any contradiction between the two things, because their model of what the mission required did not require them to choose. What the Vreth had calculated 3 years before Axiom mission launched was that humans presented a long-term resource and territorial problem, not because we were aggressive. The Vreth do not weight aggression heavily as a threat variable, because aggression is predictable and therefore manageable. What the Vreth had calculated was that humans were adaptive, that our biology was catastrophically flexible. We had evolved on a planet that had tried to kill us in every possible way for 4 billion years. And we had not merely survived, we had gotten better. We had gotten meaner and more resourceful and harder to predict. The Vreth do not handle unpredictability well. It throws their models. And a species that throws their models is, in the consortium's calculus, a species that represents risk. And risk is a problem to be solved. And the Vreth are very good at solving problems. So they had sent observers on joint missions. They framed it as scientific cooperation, and in part it was. Their engineering contributions to the Axiom reach were genuine. Their navigation data was accurate. Their biochemistry team had done work on the mission that my own department could not have replicated. They were good scientists. They were also, some of them, the most patient and methodical people I have encountered in my career. And they had been on this ship for 3 months watching us and adjusting their models. And whatever they had concluded about Merold Osi and Shaylin Addo had led them to this. A Kepler cascade that looked like a drive failure and felt like one and read like one on every diagnostic, but had been seeded with a specific small charge in a specific coupling location that Shaylin had gone to check that afternoon. She had gone to check it because someone had sent her a flagged diagnostic report. I found that out later. At the time, moving back through the forward corridor toward the sealed bulkheads, I did not know the specific mechanism. I knew the shape. The shape was enough. The bulkhead between Corridor 4 and Corridor 5 had sealed properly, is to say it was airtight and locked, and designed to require override authority from the bridge to open. I had override authority from the bridge. I was senior propulsion engineer. It was in my clearance. But the bridge communications were down in the initial cascade, which meant I needed to hardwire the override from the panel on the Corridor 4 side. I have done this exactly twice in my career, both times in drills. The third time was not a drill, and the panel was behind a wall section that had buckled in the first shockwave, which meant I spent 11 minutes on my back on the deck, with a pry bar, working a panel cover that had been designed to be removed in 15 seconds by a standing technician with 2 functioning hands. My left hand had caught the corridor railing in the shockwave, and the ring finger was not tracking correctly. I noticed this about 4 minutes in, and I filed it away the way you file things away in emergencies. Acknowledged, not important, continue. There is a particular quality to that kind of work, not the urgency. The urgency is obvious, it sits on top of everything. What I mean is the quality underneath the urgency. The way your hands move when your brain has stopped arguing about whether the situation is manageable, imaginable, and has accepted that the situation is what it is, and the only question is what you do in it. The buckled panel cover was a problem. I had the tools to address the problem. I addressed it. That is the whole of it. The bulkhead opened. Corridor 5 was dark except for the emergency strips along the floor, orange, leading toward the drive section. The air was different here. The ship's environmental system was trying to compensate for the pressure differential that the cascade had created, and it was not fully succeeding, which meant the air tasted like the inside of a capacitor bank. Not dangerous, not yet. Radiation readings on my wrist unit were elevated, but within the survivable range if I moved. I moved. Section 6 is the transition corridor. It is where the ship's architecture shifts from crew spaces to the working guts. The insulation layers, the cabling runs, the pressure vessels, the heat exchange manifolds that keep the drive section's thermal output from cooking everything forward of frame 15. Walking through Section 6 when the drive is in cascade is like walking through the inside of an argument. Every material is under stress, making noise, expanding or contracting in ways that produce sounds that the engineering mind identifies and the animal brain finds deeply wrong. Metal ticking, hiss of pressure relief valves, the low-frequency resonance of a structure, trying to hold itself together through a problem it was not fully designed to solve. I had designed part of this section. That is not a boast, it is context. The Frame 15 thermal exchange manifold had been redesigned 18 months before launch, based on a failure mode I had identified in simulation, and the redesigned version was performing now. Under cascade conditions, the way the simulation had predicted it would perform, adequately, not comfortably, adequately. There is a particular satisfaction in watching your own work hold under stress, and a particular grimness in knowing that the stress was not accidental. I found Shaylin at the junction of Sec 6 and Section 7. She was on her feet. That was the first thing I registered, that she was standing. Second thing I registered was that she had her hand pressed against her side, below the ribs, and that the way she was holding herself had the careful quality of someone who has found the position that hurts least, and is not moving from it. She looked at me the way people look at you when they were not expecting to see you, when they had done the math on their situation, and their math had not included you as a variable. Expression cycled through several things quickly. Surprise. Something that was the opposite of relief. Something like resistance. Like she did not want me to have come back for her. Then she looked at my hand and said, Your finger is broken. I told her it was probably just dislocated, she said. You shouldn't have come back. I told her I was aware of her opinion on that subject, and that she could document it in her incident report once we were on the other side of the bulkheads. She almost laughed. It was the kind of almost law that people do when they are in enough pain that humor arrives strange, sideways, not quite where it belongs. She said, the coupling failed, someone staged it. I said I knew. She said, Vreth team got to the pods 10 minutes ago. The automated manifest logged them. Took 4 of the 6 available capsules. I checked my wrist unit. She was right. 4 Vreth team members, emergency pod registry, logged 11 minutes prior. 2 remaining pods were aft of our position, reachable through the Section 7 access tunnel. But the Section 7 access tunnel ran adjacent to the drive's main cooling column, which was currently operating at a temperature that would make the tunnel itself a liability if the column vented. She had already pulled the thermal readings from the column on her own wrist unit. She showed me. The numbers were not comfortable. Did not this out loud because Shaylin could read mathematics as well as I could, and she had already done this calculation and arrived at the same answer, and was standing in Sec 6 with her hand pressed against her side, because she had concluded, before I arrived, that the answer was survivable, just barely and only alone. The mass and heat differential between one body moving through that tunnel and 2 bodies moving through it was not trivial. I told her we were going through together, and that she should stop calculating things that assumed I was not present, because those calculations were based on a false input. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, Okay, we need to go right now. The Section 7 access tunnel is 80 meters long. It runs between the main coolant column on the port side and the secondary power distribution manifold on the starboard side. And it is not a comfortable space under normal operating conditions. It is narrow enough that two people cannot walk abreast, and the ceiling is low enough that a person of my height is moving in a permanent partial crouch, under cascade conditions. With the coolant column at emergency operating temperature, and the power distribution manifold surging in response to the drive's irregular output, it was a different kind of space entirely. It was hot. Hot. Of an environment with elevated air temperature. The hot of a space where the surfaces themselves are radiating, where the metal under your hands when you steady yourself against the wall is transferring energy directly into your palm, where your exposure suit is doing work it was designed to do, but doing it continuously rather than in the brief bursts it was tested for. I went first, 'cause I was making a decision about hierarchy. We did not have time for decisions about hierarchy, but because I was the one whose job it was to know what was wrong in this section. And if something unexpected appeared in the tunnel, it made more sense for me to encounter it first. Shaylin did not argue. She followed, close. Her breathing controlled in the way that trained engineers learn to control their breathing when their bodies are doing things that the rational mind knows are within tolerances. But the animal mind finds disagreeable. I was listening to the column as I moved. Coolant column produces a specific acoustic signature under different operating conditions, and the signature under emergency thermal load has a harmonic component. A resonance in the 30 to 40 hertz range that you feel in your chest more than you hear it. That shifts in predictable ways as the pressure builds toward a release event. I had been listening to this column for 3 months. I knew its voice. 30 meters in, I started hearing the precursor. 7 meters in, Shaylin said quietly, without alarm. It's going to vent. I said, I know. 10 seconds. We pressed into the starboard wall. The distribution manifold behind us was hot against the back of my suit. The tunnel was already too warm. I kept my eyes on the port side valve panel ahead and counted. The column vented at the 40-meter mark, not a full rupture. If it had been a full rupture, we would not have had a conversation about it. It was a pressure release from one of the secondary safety valves. A controlled event in the sense that the engineering that governed it was working as designed, but not controlled in the sense that the output was a jet of superheated vapor at a pressure that would strip the installations from a cable bundle in approximately 2 seconds. The valve was on the port side, and we were pressed into the starboard wall, and the jet passed between us and the valve panel at the distance of a forearm's length, close enough that I could feel the heat of it as pressure against the side of my face. We stayed there for what I know from the timestamp was 9 seconds, though it did not feel like 9 seconds. Felt like the amount of time it takes to be certain that a thing is over. Then I straightened up. And Shaylin straightened up, and we looked at each other and continued through the tunnel. She said, once quietly, the word that she uses in her language when something has gone very wrong, and also somehow not as wrong as it could have. I don't have a translation. There are some words that don't come across. The remaining 40 meters of the tunnel were not pleasant. The thermal environment had stepped up after the vent. The column's release had reduced the pressure, but not the temperature, and the residual heat in the tunnel's atmosphere had nowhere to go. Suit's cooling system was audible, working harder than it was designed to work in a corridor traverse. I focused on the hatch at the end of the tunnel, visible as a darker rectangle against the dark wall. Once my eyes adjusted to the emergency lighting. Forward, keep moving. We reached the aft access hatch at the end of the tunnel. I worked the manual release, my broken finger contributing a specific and unpleasant sensation to the process, and the hatch opened into the aft crew section, which was unpressurized. The evacuation protocol had sealed the atmosphere in the aft section, and therefore cold and dark except for the emergency strips. Orange again, pointing toward the pod bay. Cold was a considerable improvement over the tunnel. Pod bay 2. Both pods were present. The Vreth had not taken these. I found out later why. The aft pod bay was on the far side of the coolant column vent path. The Vreth team had done their calculations before the cascade began. They had known the column would vent. They had taken the forward pods because the math said the aft pods were unreachable. The math had not included us. We suited up at the emergency lockers adjacent to the pod bay. Full EVA suits. because the pods are designed for hard vacuum launch, and the aft section's depressurization meant we were already in the approach to that environment. Shaylin suited up one-handed, mostly. Her injured side was limiting her range of motion on the left, and there was a specific moment where she was trying to lock the shoulder seal, and her face went still and white in the way that pain produces. And she stopped moving for 3 seconds and then continued. I did not comment on this. She did not want comment. What she wanted was to continue, and continuing was what we did. I sealed her helmet myself. She let me. We were at the pod bay hatch when I stopped. She looked at me through her visor. I could see the question in her face before she asked it. I told her I needed to go back. The look she gave me then was the kind of look you give a person when you are deciding how much patience you have left for them. She said, "Merrill." I told her about the drive's black box recorder. I told her that the recorder was in the drive section's data vault, behind the Cascade control board, and that it contained the full telemetry of the Cascade event from the moment it began, including the seeded charge, in the timing sequence, including the communications traffic on the Vreth team's internal network in the 60 minutes before the event. I told her that the recorder was on an automatic purge cycle, if not manually interrupted before the drive went to emergency shutdown, and that the drive was going to emergency shutdown in approximately 16 minutes according to my last diagnostic reading, and that if the recorder purged, the official incident report was going to read, Kepler Cascade, mechanical failure, caused undetermined, and that the 4 Vreth team members in their escape pods were going to rendezvous with their consortium vessel and file their own incident report, and that the 2 human engineers who died in the drive corridor were going to be listed as casualties of a tragic accident on an exploratory mission, and that there would be a service, and there would be a memorial, and nothing else would happen. I had gone over this logic in the tunnel. I had gone over it while I was pressing myself into the starboard wall, waiting for the column to vent. I had not come to any other conclusion. Shaylin stood very still while I said all of this. Then she said, "How long?" I said 11 minutes if I was clear. She said, "The tunnel won't be clear. The column vented once, it'll vent again." I said I knew. She said, "Then you're going to get yourself killed over a data recorder." I told her I was going to make sure Earth knew exactly what had happened over a data recorder, and that those weren't things, and that she should get in the pod and initiate the pre-launch sequence and wait for me to get back, and that if I was not back in 14 minutes, she should launch. She said, "I'm not launching without you." I told her she was going to launch without me if I was not back in 14 minutes, because the alternative was both of us being present when the drive went to emergency shutdown, and that was not an outcome either of us wanted. She stood there for a long moment, looking at me with the expression she uses when she has found a flaw in an argument, but has decided that pointing out the flaw is not going to change anything. The flaw was that my 14-minute estimate was optimistic and we both knew it. The drive's shutdown timeline was based on a diagnostic reading that was 11 minutes old. The actual shutdown could come sooner. Then she said, 13 minutes, not 14. I went back into the tunnel. The thermal environment was worse on the return pass. The column vent had raised the ambient temperature in the tunnel's middle section, and the residual heat had nowhere to go in a sealed corridor, which meant the air itself was now hot in addition to the surfaces. My suit was working continuously. I moved at a pace that I knew was as fast as I could sustain, without the suit's cooling system falling behind the heat load, a number I had not previously calculated for this specific configuration of suit and environment, but that I was calculating now, in real time, from the feedback the suit's sensors were giving me through the wrist display. The column vented again at the 30-meter mark. I had heard it coming. 4 seconds of precursor this time, enough to press into the port wall opposite the valve, which was the wrong wall in terms of what I would prefer, but was the available wall, and was preferable to being in the middle of the tunnel when the jet crossed. The heat from the valve casing itself was significant. I kept my eyes forward and my weight against the wall and waited. 9 seconds, I continued. The data vault in the drive section is behind the Cascade control board, which is behind a pressure door that uses the same hardwire override system as the bulkhead seals. I had done this once already. My broken finger had not improved in the interim. I did it again. The panel cover was accessible this time. No buckled wall section. And the hardwire took 4 minutes instead of 11. The vault opened. The recorder was still running. Green indicator, continuous telemetry capture, the data intact. I pulled the manual interrupt lever. There is a manual interrupt specifically so that accident investigators can preserve the record, which is a bitter irony in this context, that the tool designed to ensure investigators could reconstruct an accident was the tool I was using to ensure the accident could not be hidden, and locked the recorder into permanent hold. Then I did one more thing. The Vreth team's internal network ran on a frequency-hopped mesh protocol that was theoretically encrypted. I had spent the first month of the mission doing what any engineer does when they are sharing a vessel with beings whose communications architecture they do not fully understand. I had listened. I had not broken the encryption. I did not have the tools to break the encryption on a ship in deep space. What I had done was map the metadata, the timing patterns, the relay nodes, the traffic volume changes that preceded and followed significant events. I had done this out of professional curiosity and a degree of professional caution that I had not, at the time, been willing to label with its proper name. Looking back now, I know exactly what to call it. Engineers from Earth learn, at some point in their careers, to pay attention to the things that do not fit the stated purpose. The gap between what something is supposed to do and what it is actually doing is where problems live. I had been watching the Vreth network. The way I watch any system, I am responsible for understanding. And the patterns I had observed in the 60 minutes before the cascade were not consistent with the normal operating traffic of a science delegation. They were consistent with a coordinated, timed action. I had not acted on this observation because I had not been certain. 3 months of metadata does not constitute certainty. It constitutes a record. The drive's communications array was still operational. Cascade events damage propulsion, not necessarily communications. I had 12 minutes of telemetry from the Vreth team's network in the 60 minutes before the cascade, timestamped and traffic patterned. I packaged it with the recorder's hold confirmation into an emergency data burst and addressed it to the Earth relay, which was 40 light minutes away, and would receive it in 41 minutes, and forward it to the mission authority in approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. A long time in human terms. Not long in the terms of what would happen after. I locked the vault, sealed the pressure door, and went back through the tunnel. The column did not vent a third time. The engineering that governed it had done its work. The initial 2 vents had reduced the pressure buildup to a level that the column's continuous bleed valves could manage. The tunnel was still hot. I moved through it at the same pace as before, which was the correct pace, and I came out the far end into the cold of the aft section with 8 seconds to spare against Shaylin's count. She was in the pod bay when I got back. She was in her seat, strapped in, her hands on the pre-launch panel, and she was watching the tunnel hatch with an expression that I did not try to interpret while I was moving. I sealed the hatch behind me and crossed to the second pod, and strapped in, and began my own pre-launch sequence, she said. 11 minutes and 40 seconds, I said. I told you 13, she said. I was watching the column temperature. I adjusted the timeline. I finished my sequence. Pod's systems ran through their automated checks. Environmental, propulsion, navigation beacon, emergency transponder, and cleared green across the board. I told her, go. Both pods launched within 4 seconds of each other. The ejection acceleration is standard. 8G for 3 seconds, as the magnetic launch system clears the ship's mass shadow, and for those 3 seconds I was looking at the ceiling of a pod the size of a closet, and listening to my own heartbeat, and the structural sound of the launch sequence, and nothing else. Then the main drive cut out, and the pod went to coast, and the viewport cleared, and I was looking at the axiom reach from outside for the first time. It was a large ship. We had lived in it for 3 months. And in 3 months you stop seeing the size of a thing because the size is just the world. Outside, in the stillness of the outer solar system, with the sun reduced to a bright point, and the stars unmoving in the way they only are, when there is no atmosphere to shift them, the ship was enormous. And it was broken, and it was going to be more broken in 8 minutes. When the drive hit emergency shutdown and the cascade completed, looked at it for a long time. I thought about the people who had designed it. Engineers at 4 different facilities on 2 different continents. A 3-year design cycle. Arguments about tolerances and weight budgets. And material choices that I had been part of, that Shaylin had been part of, that had produced this particular vessel that was now drifting with a failed drive and 2 empty aft pod bays and a data vault holding a record that was currently traveling at the speed of light toward the nearest relay. I thought about Kahed Ul-Vas, the senior Vreth engineer. About the 47 conversations we had had in 3 months about propulsion engineering, about material science, about the interesting problem of heat management in a drive system that operates at the thermal limits of its components. I thought about how much of what I had told Kahed Ul-Vas about the drive systems had made the sabotage easier to plan. I thought about this without anger. The anger came later and was appropriate and is not the thing I want to talk about here. What I thought about, looking at the Axiom Reach from 90 meters away while it drifted and cooled, was the precision of the plan. How well built it was, how correctly the Vreth had identified which systems would fail, and in what order, and what the effect would be on human response behavior. How thoroughly they had modeled the scenario. The cascade was elegant, in the way that good engineering is elegant. Minimum means to achieve the desired result. They had wanted 2 engineers dead and the evidence contained, and they had built a machine for producing exactly that outcome. And it had worked precisely as designed, except for the 2 variables it had not contained. Shaylin's pod was 90 meters off my port side. See her emergency transponder blinking. I opened the pod-to-pod frequency, she said. We're going to be out here for a while. I told her the relay would have the data burst in 41 minutes. The mission authority would have it in 6 hours. A rescue response would take 72 hours minimum, more likely 96, she said. You have a ration bar? I did not. She said she had 2 and would share one when we rendezvous. She said this with the tone of someone who is establishing that normal operations will resume shortly. We are going to be fine. Not because she was certain of it, but because saying so was a choice, and she made it. Behind us, at a distance now, the Axiom Reach's drive went to emergency shutdown. There was no sound. There is no sound in space. And we were already far enough out that the electromagnetic event did not reach us in any form I could register. What I registered was the transponder data from the ship, drive status changing from cascade to shutdown, the cascade event closing, the ship going dark and cold and patient, the way that broken machines in space go dark and cold and patient, would drift. The rescue team would find it. They would find the data vault with the recorder on hold and my data burst already on its way to the relay, and the evidence of what had happened laid out in the telemetry with the kind of precision that the Vreth consortium had not anticipated, because they had built their model on the assumption that the 2 engineers trapped in the drive section would be dead. We were not dead. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I do not think clarity of this kind comes cheaply, and I do not want to sound like a person who has worked out a larger meaning than the events actually support. What I know is this. The Vreth did their calculations. They are very good at calculations. Their model of the situation was detailed and well constructed, and based on solid data about human biology and human response patterns and the specific parameters of the Axiom Reach's emergency systems. What their model did not contain was the variable that Shaylin had introduced by declining the family dinner invitation. She had gone to Section 7 because someone had flagged a diagnostic report. That choice, that small unplanned to run a check on her own time, had placed her inside the cascade's worst radius, yes, but it had also placed her in possession of the auxiliary coupling's real telemetry at the moment of failure. She had seen the charge signature before the explosion. She had documented it on her wrist unit before the first shockwave reached her. She had known what it was within 60 seconds of the event. The Vreth had built their model around the assumption that the humans would know only what they were supposed to know, that the evidence inside the disaster radius would not survive, that the data burst would not happen because the people who could send it would be dead in the drive section. They had not modeled Shaylin's diagnostic check. They had not modeled my decision to go back for her. They had not modeled the fact that the two of us, separately and together, had spent 3 months learning things about that ship that were not in our job descriptions. Out of the professional caution that engineers from Earth develop when they are working with beings whose priorities they cannot fully read. They had not modeled that the manual interrupt on the data vault recorder would be used the way I used it, because their analysis of human behavior under extreme stress had predicted that a human engineer in a drive section going to emergency cascade would prioritize escape over data preservation. They were not wrong about most humans. They were wrong about me. They were wrong, in a different way, and for different reasons, about Shaylin. That is the thing about their models. They are built on pattern recognition across very large datasets. They are excellent at predicting what a species will do in aggregate, what they cannot do, what no model can do, what the galaxy's most distributed intelligence network had not managed in 3 years of observations, is predict what 2 specific people will do when the math has been done for them, and the math says they are already dead. 91 hours. That is how long we were in the pods before the Kepler arrived. I have been in confined spaces before, professionally and otherwise. Pod is approximately the size of a large wardrobe and contains a seat, a basic life support system, a communications unit, and a storage rack with emergency supplies. It is not comfortable. It is not designed for comfort. It is designed to keep a person alive for up to 120 hours in hard vacuum, and it performs this function adequately, which is all that matters. The first 6 hours were the hardest. Not physically. The pods were doing their work. The life support was nominal. The communications unit was functioning, and I had been in worse physical situations and managed my attention. What made the first 6 hours hard was the uncertainty. The data burst had been sent. The relay would receive it in 41 minutes. After that, I did not know what would happen, which is an unusual condition for an engineer to accept. Engineers work with knowns and unknowns, and we have tools for the unknowns. Models, projections, tolerance ranges. What I had was a decision I had made, a signal traveling at the speed of light through the outer solar system, and no ability to affect the outcome on the other end. I found this harder than the tunnel. Shaylin, when I told her this on the pod-to-pod frequency, said, "That's because in the tunnel you had something to do. You always do better when you have something to do." I asked her if this was a criticism. She said, "It's an observation, I'm the same way." She paused. "The ration bar offer stands, by the way. You should eat." I told her I was not hungry. She said, "You've had a physically demanding several hours and your blood sugar is going to drop whether you feel hungry or not. Eat something." I ate something. Shaylin and I talked through the pod-to-pod frequency for most of those 91 hours, which I suspect extended both our lives in a different sense. Not the biological sense, but the sense in which having someone to think alongside makes the very long hours bearable. We talked about the mission. We talked about the Axiom reaches systems, going over the Cascade event in detail, the way engineers do when an event is over, and the immediate pressure is gone, and the mind wants to reconstruct. We talked about what we had missed, what we had noticed too late, what we would document in the formal incident report. Shaylin had noticed things I had not. She had been in Section 7 when the diagnostic flag came in, a flag from the Vreth team's engineering liaison, framed as a routine anomaly in the coupling's pressure telemetry. In retrospect, the anomaly was not a real anomaly. It was a constructed one, designed to draw an engineer with the right clearances to the right location at the right time. What Shaylin had noticed, while she was running the diagnostic, was that the anomaly's timestamp did not match the coupling's operational log. The anomaly had appeared in the telemetry after the operational log, which should not be possible if the anomaly was real. She had been in the process of cross-referencing this discrepancy when the first shockwave hit. She had documented the charge signature. In the 3 minutes between the shockwave and losing communications with the forward section, minutes, injured, alone in a drive section, and she had still documented the evidence. I think about this. I think about what that costs in terms of focus and intention, when every physical signal your body is sending you is about the injury and the danger and the need to move. She had overridden all of that to make the record, because she had understood, in those 3 minutes, that the record was the thing that would matter afterward. Talked about her sister's children. I listened to this with more attention than I usually gave it. It seemed, in the pods, like the correct thing to attend to. She asked me once, in the 40th hour, what I had been thinking when I went back through the tunnel the second time. I told her I had been thinking about the recorder, about the data burst, about the 6 hours between the relay receiving the transmission and the mission authority making a decision. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not all of it." I told her it was most of it. She said, "You were thinking that if we didn't send the record, they'd do it again, to someone else, on the next mission." I told her she was probably right. She said, "I was thinking the same thing when I documented the charge signature. I knew I was hurt. I knew the situation. I documented it anyway, because if I didn't make it out, I wanted it to exist somewhere." We did not say anything for a while after that. The pods drifted in the silence of the outer solar system. The sun was a bright point. The stars did not move. The confirmation that the relay had received our burst came through as a signal ping at the 43-minute mark. 2 minutes late, which told me the relay had needed to confirm the transmission before responding, which meant the burst had been flagged as priority. Someone on the relay's automated system had read the priority coding the header and escalated. Good. I passed this information to Shaylin. She said, 6 hours from now. Meaning, in 6 hours, someone at Mission Authority will know what happened. I said, yes, she said, and then we wait for the ship. That was the shape of it. We waited for the ship. The pods drifted. The Axiom Reach went cold and dark behind us, its transponder pinging every 60 seconds with the patient regularity of a machine that does not know it is broken. The sun was too far away to provide warmth. The insulation in the pods did that work instead, and it did it well enough. The Kepler came at the 91st hour, running on an emergency intercept course that I was told later broke 3 mission profile records. I asked the commander, afterward, how long it took after receiving the data burst for the authorization to come through. She said, 6 minutes. 6 minutes, from the data arriving to the decision being made. 6 minutes. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about what it meant that the people on the other end of the relay had received the burst, had read the telemetry, had assessed the evidence, and had put a ship on intercept course in 6 minutes. That is human decision speed. Not optimized consortium processing, not distributed network consensus. One person reading a report and knowing in 6 minutes what needed to happen. The Vreth consortium, I was told in the mission debriefs, objected formally to the data burst's admissibility. They argued that the recorder data had been manually interrupted and therefore compromised. They argued the traffic pattern analysis was speculative. They argued several things with considerable patience and specificity over the following months. And some of those arguments were technically sound. Consortium law is not simple, and the Vreth are meticulous. What they had not argued against was one Shaylin's wrist unit recording. She had documented the charge signature before the explosion, and the wrist unit's data was unimpeachable. It had been captured on a sealed system she had not been able to access after the event, which meant the record was clean. For the signature, the seated charge profile that the Kepler's forensic team reconstructed from the drive section's debris. The match was not approximate, it was exact. The consortium proceedings are still ongoing, as far as I know. These things take time. What I know from this side of it, Shaylin spent 6 weeks in medical after the rescue. Cracked rib and the secondary impact injury healed on schedule. Not a person who finds extended medical care easy. She had been working on documents and reports from the hospital bed by the 3rd day, which the medical staff objected to and which she continued, regardless. I visited when I could. We did not talk much about the tunnel or the pods or the math. We talked about her sister's new posting and the mission artifact registry, which I had finally completed. We talked about the next mission on the roster, which was scheduled for the following year, and whether we were going to be on it. She said she was going to be on it. I asked her if she thought that was wise, given everything. She gave me a look that contained a number of things I will not try to list here, and then she said, "The consortium put 4 agents on a joint mission to get rid of 2 engineers. That means 2 engineers matter. Why would I stop?" I did not have an answer for that. I still don't, exactly. I know what I think about it, and what I think is that she is right, and that the consortium's models are going to have to be updated, and that the update models are going to have to contain a variable that I do not think translates cleanly into consortium mathematics. The variable is this: humans from Earth do not stay dead when the math says they are dead. We have been doing this for 4 billion years. We did not stop doing it because the math got more sophisticated. We did not stop doing it because the tunnel got hotter, or the shutdown timer got shorter, or the people doing the calculating were very, very good at their work. We went back in. We documented the charge. We sent the burst. We drifted in the pods for 91 hours and talked about each other's families and waited for the ship that we knew was coming. That is not heroism. I want to be clear about that. Heroism implies that a person did something they did not have to do. Everything I did because I looked at the alternative and found it unacceptable. That is not a virtue. It is just a standard. My finger healed. Left ring finger, clean break at the second phalanx, 6 weeks in a brace. The medical team told me it was a textbook fracture and would heal without complications. They were correct. I filed the mission artifact registry. My sister's name is on it now. The Axiom Reach was recovered and returned back to Terran space, where it is currently in the hands of the forensic engineering teams. They are rebuilding the Cascade event from the inside out. They are very thorough. They will find everything. We are going to be on the next mission. Shaylin has already confirmed her position. Confirmation is pending, which is a bureaucratic status, and not a decision. The decision was made in the pod bay aft of the drive section, on a ship the Vreth consortium had broken to specifications, when I looked at the tunnel and went back into it. That is the decision I live with. Not with difficulty, just with the weight of it, which is the appropriate weight for a decision of that kind, and which I would make again without hesitation. There is nothing else to say about that, except this. At 14-7 on the 3rd month of the outbound leg, 2 engineers from Earth were in a drive corridor going to Emergency Cascade, and the consortium had done their calculations. And the calculations said the corridor would be empty by 14-15. It was not empty by 14-15. The corridor was still occupied at 14-15 and at 14-23 when we came out the other side, dirty and burned at the margins and carrying evidence of a crime that the consortium had built a ship-killing disaster to erase. I have been asked since whether I was afraid. Yes. In the tunnel, the second time, with the column hot against the suit's insulation layer and the timer counting down in my head, yes, I was afraid. In the pods, in the long quiet of the outer solar system, waiting for a ship that was 72 hours away at minimum, and that I had sent a signal to but could not confirm had received. Yes, I was afraid then too. I kept moving because afraid and moving are not mutually exclusive. They never have been. That is not a revelation. That is just the physics of it. And the physics was not going to change, because the Vreth had run better numbers. We came from a death world. We have always come from a death world. The fear is part of the equipment,